Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Founder to Founder podcast. Today, I have a very special guest named Tim DeRoche. I actually saw him on a stage about a year ago, and I was actually captivated by the talk because it really highlighted things that have happened along my educational journey. So, we'll get into that and more from the books. But thank you so much, Tim, for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Felicia. I'm eager to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. So, yeah, we'll do back and forth and we'll talk about your experiences and mine. But to dive right on in, my first question is one of the things that really stuck out to me in your book is how often segregation is described as organic or an accidental thing. Can you walk us through why that framing is like so misleading?
Yeah, so Richard Rothstein covered this in his book, The Color of Law. There's kind of this myth that we've gotten rid of of official governmental segregation, right? And there's this myth that all the rest of kind of the patterns of how we divide ourselves or where we live or the patterns that we see in the real world of segregation, that was just people, individual people making choices. And so Rothstein covers what an active role the government played in segregating neighborhoods, especially. And he especially covers the topic of redlining, right? So this
Mhm.
was the practice. There was a federal agency back in the 30s. So this was the New Deal era. And they had passed a whole bunch of programs, right, to put money into the hands of Americans. Right? You had all the what were they called? The public progress programs. I'm losing the word. Like the CCC, the Conservation Corps. They're putting money into the economy, and one of the things they did is put money into mortgage assistance programs, right?
Mhm.
And so this federal agency went around, and there wasn't money for everyone, and so they had to make choices about who this money is going to go to. So this agency went around and drew maps of lots and lots of major cities, and they color coded different neighborhoods based on whether they should qualify for this assistance or not. And so green areas were the best, blue areas were desirable, yellow areas were declining, and red areas were hazardous. And so yellow and red shaded areas had people who lived in those areas of all races had trouble getting mortgage assistance. But the problem is what were the definitions they were using? Well, they were saying, well, if there's a high concentration of African Americans in this neighborhood, then we are going to designate it as hazardous. Not just African Americans, right? Um, you know, other minorities, other people of color, working class folks. So you just had this kind of insidious pattern of discrimination enforced by the government, right? And not just by the choices of where people live. Now there were other restrictive covenants and other things. The government enforced restrictive covenants prohibiting that allowed you to put into the contract when you sold a home, right? You would say you can never sell this. I ran into this first. I was on the board of a charter school on the west side
Okay.
of LA, and they were looking for a new place to build a building, right? They were
Mhm.
renting a building. It was too small. So they're looking for a building, and they're bringing properties to the board to look at. And so they gave us the documents for some property. And so I'm just reading it from the point of view of, okay, what is this property about? And right in there is a covenant saying you can't sell, if you buy this property, you can never sell it to an African American. I think there were other groups listed like Chinese American immigrants or things like that. It was a while ago, but it was eye opening. You're used to seeing these things when you're looking at historical documents, you're reading about racial discrimination, you're reading a book about it or something. But the extraordinary thing was to like just run into it in your life, right? It
Yeah.
really was quite astounding. And now those aren't enforceable anymore. So it was still written into some of those legal documents, but you can't enforce something like that anymore. Thank goodness. The courts have said that is illegal and unconstitutional.
But those themes and those types of things that were written once upon a time still echo through time. And I think when I read your book, when you talked about a lot of those things, it just I could really see like how those things have stayed in place, even
Sure.
though we say that they aren't everything is equal, but it really isn't. And that actually kind of leads me to my next question. There were some school leaders in your book that you mentioned in there where they said they're like, oh, well, they kind of toss up their hands. They're like, we're just respecting where families choose to live. We have nothing to do with
Yeah.
where they go and stuff. What are they actually protecting when they say those types of things?
Well, so yeah, the so my book, it's called A Fine Line, that
Right.
you read, and thank you for reading. I love to hear it when people read the book. Put so much work into that book. That was like
Yeah.
years of research. And what we talk about in the book are these lines. Redlining is illegal, right? You cannot
Mhm.
discriminate against people based on where they live in real estate anymore, right? In finances, right? In mortgages, right? You're not allowed to, in banking, you're not allowed to do that. But the place where we allow this to go on, discriminating against people based on where they live, sanctioned by the government, is in school zones and school district lines. And so, really, education, K-12 education, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, that is the one place in our economy where you can still say, nope, I'm not going to serve you. You live on the wrong side of a line, right? We don't do that with public parks. We don't
No.
do that with public libraries. We certainly don't do it with daycare centers or even like grocery stores. That'd be ridiculous. That just doesn't happen. Now, many people shop at local grocery stores, but that doesn't mean no one's drawing lines to keep their neighbors out, right? Or to keep people
Yeah.
from the town over out of their grocery store or their healthcare clinic, for example.
Yeah.
So basically, I remember I was writing a chapter of the book, and I was making the case that these zone lines, these exclusionary zone lines and district lines that kind of carve up our neighborhoods for school purposes, that they're sort of analogous to redlining, right? They're saying
Mhm.
who gets access to a valuable government service based on where you live. And then I remember I had this moment. I was like, well, wait a second. These are maps, right? I can compare them. And so what I started doing, I pulled out right away. I live in Los Angeles, and I pulled up this very coveted school called Ivanhoe Elementary. It's in the
Yeah.
Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles, a couple miles northeast of or northwest of downtown, I think, and pulled up the map, the attended zone map. This is within the LA Unified School District. And then I pulled up on another tab, I pulled up Mapping Inequality. It's this great resource. It's the University of Richmond in Virginia. They have all of these high resolution redlining maps from the 1930s that they've put online. You can search them. There are ways you can kind of manipulate them. And so I get both of those up, and I'm trying to like line them up. I'm trying to figure it out. And then it just pops off the page, right? The school zone for Ivanhoe still covers the area of town that was considered desirable back in the 30s. And it's boxing out. You can see it's surrounded by red and yellow areas on the redlining map that were deemed to be declining or hazardous because they had significant numbers of people of color, of immigrants, working class folks, and that quote unquote desirable area was more middle class folks or upper middle class folks. And just as it is today, it's quite expensive to live in that Ivanhoe zone. And so one of the things we talk about in the book is that it just creates, so you already have levels of, I don't want to say segregation, but you have dividing lines along the lines of race and class, right? Some neighborhoods are going to be more expensive, so they're going to attract wealthier people, right? And there are just cultural patterns, right? Some certain types of folks are going to cluster in certain places. And so if there are only a select few high quality public schools in a city, which is true of most of our major cities, there's scarcity, right? Everybody wants to go to that school. Well, how do you get into that school? You buy a home in the zone. So what happens is young families cram into these coveted zones, driving up real estate. So you've got houses. So the Ivanhoe zone, for example, already covers most of the large single family homes in the neighborhood on big lots. So it's already very expensive to buy the average home in that zone. But then when you add on to that, people are like, the real estate agents are like, well, if you buy a home in this zone, you don't have to pay for private school. And so then what you see, and we have anecdotal evidence that, people will pay $200,000 to $300,000 more to live inside the zone because then they get access to this school. So we're bundling schooling and housing. And the economics term for this is that you're capitalizing the cost or the price of a high quality education into the home value. which is it's like the dumbest thing you could do if you wanted to ensure equal opportunity, because you're basically saying, well, not only do you need high income to go to this school as you would for like a private school, but you need wealth, right?
Yeah.
You need to be able to afford the down payment to get, to get into that zone. And most of these coveted zones do not have a lot of apartments, right? So there's not a
Mhm.
lot of rentals. And then I had a school admissions consultant here in LA tell me, well, if you want to go in one of these coveted zones for one of the very few apartments in the zone, you're going to pay $1,000 extra
Wow.
for the same apartment on one side of the street versus the other side of the street if it's in the zone for this coveted school, because again, you don't have to pay for private schools, so people are bidding up the price of those apartments. So what we're doing is we're making our best schools available only to wealthy people, and that is just contrary to the mission of the public schools, right? Like the mission of the public schools is supposed to be to serve all, to be
Mhm.
open to all. The Brown v. Board of Education decision said, the public schools, if the government doesn't just have to provide a public education, but if it does, those schools have to be available to all on equal terms. And in addition, the public schools that, the great Horace Mann quote that this is supposed to be the great equalizer. Well, if you want the public schools to be a great equalizer, then you can't ration access to the best schools based on wealth, right? That's not going to do what you want to do. So we've been trying to expose all these shenanigans. So we've published all these maps, right,
Mhm.
showing that that these coveted schools often have zones that replicate the redlining maps. Not always, but whether they replicate the old redlining map or not, they're still doing the same job that the redlining map did, which is they're saying people who live in this area, we're going to give them privileged access to this government service, which should be available to everybody, or at least everybody should have an equal shot. Like if you don't have enough to serve everybody, if there aren't enough seats, then you got to give everybody a fair shot.
Yeah, and for me, one of the lines in the book, you say a license to discriminate. So
Yeah.
there's this in, I think it's chapter 2.
Hmm.
You talk about 2 schools in Chicago,
Yep.
and one is North Avenue and
One
Mary
is one is
Lincoln
Lincoln Avenue, and then Manier,
Manier.
which is south, and their dividing line between the two attendance zones is North Avenue. Yep.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that clarification. I read that part and I was kind of taken aback because for those out there, basically these schools are super close and Lincoln Avenue is the school to go to and the other one is not the school to go to and they're just separated by an imaginary line. So can you tell us more about that story and how those kids are affected? Because I know at one point, the underperforming school was going to close, and then all the other kids were supposed to go to Lincoln, but that didn't happen. And I just really resonated with that story. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, what they were going to do is they were having a problem because all these young families were jamming into Lincoln, right?
Mhm.
And so this is Chicago Public Schools, CPS. They've got an overcapacity problem. So right, they have too many schools. Many of the schools are half empty. But the problem is Lincoln, that is not true for Lincoln because all these young families are jamming into Lincoln. So a few years ago, Lincoln, this coveted school, is overcrowded. It's an elementary school. And they propose, and we've seen this happen in several different places around the country.
Yeah.
They kind of float the idea, the board floats the idea of redrawing the attendance zone boundaries, because within walking distance of many of these neighborhoods that are assigned to Lincoln, you've got half empty schools. So from a purely financial standpoint, from a purely logistical and efficiency standpoint, the district's like, oh, well, we could just let's redraw these lines, send some of these Lincoln kids to these surrounding schools that are half empty, right? Well, you can imagine how that went over, right? The people who send their kids to Lincoln, most of them bought their homes knowing that they were zoned to Lincoln, thinking, oh, I'm guaranteed. I'm not only buying a home, I'm buying a ticket to Lincoln Elementary, right? And then for the district to say, we might, reassign you to another school, they're basically saying, well, we're going to take your ticket away, right? And so what do? They go, these are upper income parents. They go to the state Senate. And my understanding is that they convinced the state, Illinois is in the middle of a budget crisis at the time, but they convinced the state to allocate like 18 and 19 million dollars. They do this with the superintendent. I think it was Rahm Emanuel at the time. and or the mayor. I'm sorry, the mayor, not the superintendent. And they arranged for the state to give CPS 18 or 19 million dollars to renovate Lincoln, right? To add more capacity to Lincoln. So the problem is you've got all these people living right around Lincoln who are lower income. So they add capacity to Lincoln. Do they open up the school to anyone outside that zone? No, they don't. What what they did, they spent that $19 million to add capacity in a neighborhood that had plenty of capacity, had lots, hundreds and hundreds of open seats at public schools in the neighborhood, but they had to spend 18 to 19 million dollars to protect those families, right? And I'm sympathetic to those families, right? Like those
Yeah.
families played by the rules, they bought their homes based on this, but you can't, this is a dead end, right? Like if you invest in these schools for wealthier folks, then what you see is that everybody around is like, well, we can't get into Lincoln. We're going to move out of Chicago, right? I can't afford to live in the Lincoln zone. And you've got these schools that are underperforming. At Menier, at one point, not a single eighth grader graduated from that school being able to read at grade level. Not a single eighth grader. So if you're a parent, you don't want your kid to go to Menier Elementary. And I'm sure there are good people working there, but that is a failing school. Let's just be honest about it. And so what you have is what I've seen in other places that when you have a coveted school like this, the surrounding areas start to hollow out and young families start to move out. And you see, or they start to choose other schools for their kids, whether it's a magnet school or a charter school or a private school if they can afford it, because you have a high quality school that's within walking distance of my home, but you've told me I'm on the wrong side of the line. I can't go to that school. And you want me to go to a school where not a single eighth grader can read at grade level? That's a joke, right? Like those people are not going to buy into public education. Right. And so my argument has been part of the reason that you see the public's trust in education, public education declining is that people can see there are these high quality public schools and my kids aren't welcome there. Right.
Yeah.
Even when I'm 5 minutes away, or maybe it's right across the street from my work. Right. Maybe it's a half hour away from my home, but it's 5 minutes, it's right across the street from my work. Can my kid go there? Nope. Sorry. And so, yeah, it's a problem. So where did you grow up, Felicia?
So it was actually going to bring me to that. So I went
Yeah.
to pre-K and kindergarten in LA in Culver City.
Oh, you did?
And my memory of that time, which was prompted by this particular story, is
Yeah.
we we used my great uncle's address so we could go to a better school. So right before this interview, I Googled those schools because I was like, I don't know anything about it's been years.
Yeah.
So it turns out those schools are actually some of the top rated schools in Culver City. I
Well,
just
Culver City is very, very, I mean, it's a district, it's a carve out of LA, right? So
okay.
the LA Unified School District is huge in Southern California, just sprawls and sprawls, but there are a couple
Here.
carve outs. So Beverly Hills has its
Okay.
own district, but it's completely surrounded by the District of Los Angeles. Culver
Okay.
City is another one where it's surrounded by Los Angeles Unified School District, but Culver City is, yeah, kind of carved out.
Okay. And then I know at one point we couldn't go to a school for some reason and then
Yeah.
put us in another school. And then we left the state. We moved to Arizona.
Oh, okay.
We got a quality education at those schools. I remember it being a big deal as a child
Yeah.
because one of the things I was told is like, just tell your teachers you don't know where you live.
Yeah. I don't know my address. I don't know my
Oh,
address. Yeah.
if anybody asks, you don't know where you live. And I know there's this argument, you bring it up in your book, but there's also this argument of like the morality of lying about your address. For me personally, I know how it has affected my life. My parents doing what they did had a positive impact on my life. I know that for
Sure.
a fact.
Sure.
So I know the people that argue like, hey, like you shouldn't be doing that. But what is your counter argument to people that say like that is wrong? You should go to your own school, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's civil disobedience in a way, right? Like these are bad laws, right? And
Mhm.
and what I would say is people lie about their address all the time, and it's not just lower income folks, right? It
Mhm.
is up and down the spectrum. Like I talked to a Malibu mom, right? The mom of one of my friend's wife's mom. And she said, "Oh yeah, we lived in Malibu, but we wanted our kid to go to Santa Monica High, so we paid our neighbor for their, to put our name on their gas bill." I'm not sure exactly how that worked,
Mhm.
but this is very common. My family actually lied about our address. We lived down in the city center of LA at one point, and we
Okay.
we our kids were actually in a school that was mainly lower income kids. It was one particular pre-K teacher that we loved, and then we ended up moving a little bit out, but we wanted our son to have that same teacher because she was
Mhm.
so good. So a lot of people lie about their address to send their kids to suburban schools, right? People
Yeah.
who live in the city and they lie to get in the suburban school. We did the opposite. We lied about our address to get our kids into the inner city school. And they didn't say anything. I mean, what I would say is these are, for the most part, right, these are very selectively enforced laws, right? And so we worked with Kelly Williams Bolar. She's a parent liaison for us. She was put in jail in Ohio for using her dad's address, right? And there are just all sorts of ethical and moral problems with that. Like, so her dad built a home in Copley Fairlawn, right? This suburban area. He built a home. So he added to the tax base of this city. He's paying property taxes. He no longer has any kids. And his daughter, wants to get her kids out of the violent and dangerous schools in Akron. And she lives 10 minutes away. So she uses his address and they came after her. And then she learned later that, they told the football players, right, or the basketball players who were lying about their address, well, just keep your head down, right? This will all blow over. They're only going after this person, right? They're going
Mhm.
to make her an example out of her, but you keep your head down because we want you in this school. It's like, really, really bad behavior. And so, you know, I would argue your parents did nothing wrong at all. And that if we have a system like this, people are going to use different addresses, right? I know people, you move and you just don't tell the district. Your kid's going into senior year of high school. You're just like, well, I'm not going to tell the district that I moved because he's going to get kicked out. He's not going to be able to be with his friends, senior year. These are really, really dumb laws. And I would argue they're not just dumb, but they're unjust. And so I have no problem with people getting around them. And I do think more of us should be speaking out. I love that you're coming out and telling the story publicly. We need to be speaking out against these laws in addition to just undermining them, right? And
Mhm.
I do want to undermine them. And I think it'll be good for our country when we move past these. But yeah, I think it's great that your parents were trying to do that. Do you know which schools you were zoned to go to? Like which schools you were assigned to? You don't
No,
remember your address or anything? No.
I was really, really
You were
young,
little, yeah, yeah.
and even when we moved to Arizona, my parents sought out the best schools and made sure
Yeah.
we went there as well.
Yeah,
So
I mean, those are the parents I admire, right? Like who are, actively, and I will say, like, some of these coveted public schools, like I'm not sure, they're probably not the right fit for everybody, right?
mhm, yeah,
And some of them, their high scores may just be a result of all these people, overeducated people, crowding into the zone and sending all their overeducated kids to the same. And those kids are going to do very well on scores. I just think parents in general should be paying way more attention to the schools. Like, I would never send my kid to a school solely because it got an A or it's got a 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 on great schools. Like, you want to go to the school, you want to talk to the teachers, talk to the principal. I mean,
question.
you should be visiting 3 to 5 schools, before you enroll your kids, right? Especially your oldest, right? If you get your oldest in a good situation and they're
They always
thriving, then you can kind of let the other ones kind of go. But, you know, on the front end, you got to be very careful to understand, even a school with good scores can have a dysfunctional environment, right?
yes,
Or it can be riding the coattails, of things that happened years ago, and maybe the instruction there isn't that good, or maybe it's not the right fit for your kid. Maybe it's a great school, but it's not the right fit for this particular kid. So I just think parents should be paying way more attention, and I admire any parents that are doing that. Do you have kids?
I do, I have 3.
Oh, cool. How old?
My oldest is 11 and then 9 and then 5.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, you're sort of we have 4 between 10
Okay.
and 1. So we're
Okay.
our 3 older ones are about around the same as yours. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I created a micro school because I wasn't happy with the district in Nevada, and that
Yeah.
now we're in Florida, and they're actually going to private schools, and I
What
drive them 30 minutes
Yeah.
because I believe in those schools, so I'm willing to make the drive.
Yeah. Where do you live in Tampa? I mean, in Florida?
I live in Palm Coast.
Oh, you do. I don't know where Palm Coast is. Yeah.
It's 30 minutes north of Daytona, so it's kinda
Okay.
small, and
Yeah.
found some schools in Ormond, which are 30 minutes-ish
Yep.
minutes south, and
Okay.
we love them. There's a Montessori and then a middle school, and they're doing great.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I was in Tampa earlier
Oh,
this
okay.
year because there were some things going on in Tampa where they closed down a school that served the African American community. And then once they closed that school, there were a whole bunch of A-rated schools just to the south for those people. And not a
Okay.
single kid who went to the closed school was allowed to go to the A-rated schools that were now minutes
Oh,
from their home. They were bused up to C and D rated schools away out of their community because the district had these majority minority schools that were not doing that well and that had lots of empty seats, and they're like, well, we can't let those kids into the A-rated school, that's close to their, so we'll try to fill these empty seats in these C and D rated schools. This is not good.
it's not
Anyway,
okay.
yeah, exactly.
Wow. I wanna touch on this story from Philadelphia because it was when I started reading it, it felt like, "Here's a solution," and then it turned, and I was like, "Oh my gosh." So, this story, it's Penn Alexander Elementary School,
Yep.
and basically the university came in and turned around a school, and it was supposed to be for middle class working families, primarily African American. Can you tell us more about that story and how that actually shaked out?
Yeah, so my understanding is that so it's a public school, and I think it was a
Mhm.
new school, so it wasn't a turnaround. They
Okay.
they partnered with the Philadelphia School District, the University of Pennsylvania. This is a private Ivy League school, and they partnered to create this, kind of unique school. Both the district and Penn is UPenn is right in the middle of Philly, like it's in a pretty urban neighborhood, kind of like USC in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And so they put a whole bunch of money into this school. I think, created a very nice facility, injected a lot of high quality teacher talent into that school. So great. Wonderful. What happened, and this was primarily a working class neighborhood with lots and lots of African American folks who'd been there for a long, long time. So what happens though is they insert it, and then they had to redraw the attendance zone boundaries, right? So they created a new attendance zone, and what you saw, this school very, very quickly became one of these coveted schools, right? And what happens is when these schools become coveted, right? If a private school becomes coveted, then they get lots of applications,
Yeah.
right? They can probably be choosy about who they let in. They can be selective. Maybe they raise their price, right?
Mhm.
And you can argue about, what are the effects of that? I would argue, you're right. If you raise the price of a private school or you make it more selective, you're going to have less of a mix at that private school. It's going to change the nature of who's going to that private school. But everybody sees that about the private school. But the same thing happens in a different way with a public school that becomes so coveted. So, what happens when the public school becomes so coveted? Well, people are going to do whatever they need to do to get their kids into that school. So, what do? They buy homes in that tiny little zone. So, there's this macro neighborhood, this working class neighborhood. And there is a bit of my understanding is there was a bit of gentrification going on. It was during the real estate boom. And so you were seeing prices go up in general in that neighborhood. But what you saw is that within the zone for that particular school, the real estate prices shot up through the roof, right? Even more, like 3 times as much as, and I haven't looked at this study. It was actually done by researchers, economists at UPenn, and they looked at, okay, what happened to real estate in the surrounding areas? What happened to real estate in that Penn Alexander new attendance zone? And the new attendance zone it went through the roof because all of these people were buying homes. And so what you had is the forces of gentrification magnified in that zone. And so you saw basically working class folks who'd lived there for decades, either if they owned their homes, selling out to these people willing to pay ridiculous prices, or if they were renting, their landlords kind of saying, okay, we're going to kick these people out and we're going to, renovate the home and then sell it to some of these new folks coming in. And so what you saw is that the percentage of African American folks who go to that school declined significantly over time, right?
Yeah.
And the percentage of low income folks who went to that school declined over time. It'd be interesting to know. So is that's what you were talking about, that particular?
Yeah, because I found it interesting because there's a part where you cite where one of the landlords actually evicted everyone out of the apartment complex and
Yep.
just upped the price of the building and sold it because he could,
Yep.
because the housing prices went up dramatically.
Yep.
So the school that was created for middle class kiddos and their families are now for the upper class again. And this thing that was built to help more families
Yep.
is no longer there for them.
Yeah, it says only 13% of the kids at that school anymore are African American.
Wow.
It does say Great Schools says 100% of the kids are from low income families. I am skeptical of that number.
Mm.
I don't often see 100%. And knowing what I know about that neighborhood, 45% of the kids who go there are white, 27 are Asian. So you've got 2% of the kids are white or Asian. I would be very surprised if that low income number is correct. Regardless, what you can say is that, this was a largely, I don't know if it was majority African American, but it may say in my book, I wrote that book 5 or 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
Actually, more than that, I wrote that book 7 years ago, man. But there was a significant African American population, and now only 13% of the kids who go to that school are African American. It's just and I think,
Rough.
if they had created that school and allowed, let's say it was a magnet school that drew from the whole district, or that had no, like it was a charter school or something, or at least let's say it's a regular public school, but it has like charter school or magnet type enrollment policies where you don't have to buy. Well, then it's not going to distort the real estate market, right? Because people are going to buy homes. Now they're going to want to live close to the school. And I can understand that. People sometimes hear me say this stuff and they're like, oh, well, I don't want my kid bused halfway across town. Well, neither do I. I'm a big fan of finding, I don't want to drive 30 minutes to
Every
a
day.
school. I might have to, right? I might be willing to make that sacrifice. For the kids' current school, I would make that sacrifice if I had to.
Mhm.
I don't have to. And we partially bought our home to be close to the school. But that's different than saying, oh, we're going to draw a line around we're going to let the government draw a line around the school, and everybody who lives outside that line can't go, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in that case, sometimes you get people who can walk to a school, right? They live so close to a school they can walk to it, but the line got drawn where it got drawn, and they are not allowed to go. And so it's a horrible way to allocate seats in public schools. And I
Mhm.
know most people think it's just common sense. I think these common sense policies, these quote unquote common sense policies, have done a lot of damage
Yeah.
to middle class and lower income folks. And I think they've done damage to the trust in the public schools.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, what responsibility, if any, do districts or cities have to ensure that improvement doesn't equal displacement?
So what do you say more about that? What do you mean?
So, in this case that we just talked about with Alexander
Oh,
Elementary,
right.
do you
Yep.
feel like that they had any responsibility ensuring that those families weren't displaced down the line? Now, of course, they don't know, they might not have known that at the time, but moving forward, we would, if something like that were to happen today,
Yeah.
I'll do a
Well,
little research, you can figure it out that might happen. So
Well,
what
I would say there's a moral imperative not to base enrollment decisions based on where people live, right? And there are two pieces of that. One piece is just you're determining kids' fate. So you're kind of sorting kids into winners and losers when they're
True.
5 years old, like with kindergarten. So
Yeah.
that's one. But you're bringing up another point, which is that these school districts are distorting the real estate market, right? And they are contributing to the affordability crisis, right? Because everybody's like, oh, well, if I'm going to have kids, I got to be able to afford to live in one of these zones. And that means paying a lot extra for my home. I got to be able to afford a house that's like, much, much more expensive. And I think that these school districts, I know they don't think this way, but I think that the board members of these districts and the planning, like the planners, because
Mhm.
most of these big districts, they employ planners. Like these are urban planners. And I think these urban planners, they get caught up in, okay, we're going to go plant this new school and we're going to invest in it, right? And we're going to draw this line. And I think if those planners were honest with themselves and if they were doing their complete job as planners, they would acknowledge that those lines have done tremendous damage, not only to families, but they've done tremendous damage to micro neighborhoods that get excluded from these schools, these coveted public schools. And so you see the hollowing out of these neighborhoods that don't have access to nearby high quality public schools. And that I think has caused the deterioration of some of these neighborhoods. I think it's led to young families leaving the city. For a while, young
Yeah.
families were moving back into the city. And I think in some cases now you've got the opposite happening. Or some of those folks are just saying, oh, well, I can only afford to live here. I'm not even going to have kids. I mean, you can see in the declining rates of people having children. They think that, if they would never have a child and send them to one of these failing schools. So they're just like, well, I'm just not going to have kids, or I'm only going to have one, and maybe try to send them to a private school. So I just think we're playing with fire here. We're messing with things that we shouldn't mess with. And I do think the districts have an obligation. There's nothing. We did a big review a few years ago. We did a study called The Broken Promise of Brown v. Board of Ed. And we did a big study of state laws. Most states do not require school districts to operate attendance zones, right?
Mhm.
Now, almost all states I think all states allow them to operate attendance zones, but they do not require. So what that means is that these districts are choosing to do it this way, right? And what's amazing is that these school districts are mainly, even in the red states, they're controlled by Democrats. They're controlled by the left, who seems to be very concerned about equal opportunity on the surface and concerned about segregation. But then you have these leaders who are operating systems and showing no interest in dismantling these barriers to equal opportunity. That the
Mhm.
urban districts, they're not pleased with me for continuing to bring this stuff up, right? It makes things more difficult for them because their parents who write checks to board members largely live in these coveted zones. So the board members don't like to contemplate, what would it be like if the zones were less, like, not even getting rid of the zones, right? What if they were
Yeah.
just less important, right? What if every school had to admit 15% kids from outside their zone? That would affect a very small number of schools, but the districts have a hard time thinking about that because these parents write checks to board members and these board members are trying to keep those parents happy. And they can talk all they want about racial justice and social justice and equal opportunity and public education being open to all and it's going to be the great equalizer. You're in charge of that system.
Yeah.
You can advocate for whatever change you want to advocate for. And no one, right? Even the board members who understand this problem and who will say to me, yeah, I get it, this is a big problem, they're not really raising their voices to change the policies. So,
And when I read it, like it does feel like a silent war that is happening because in your book you talk about there's tip lines and investigations that are going on, private investigators to prove that kids are going to schools that they don't belong to.
yeah.
So I was shocked at the amount of resources dedicated to maintaining the status quo.
Yeah, and they don't, they recently did a big round of public records requests to the largest districts in California and the wealthiest districts in California. And so we got all these documents back. And, some of the districts just said, oh, we have nothing, or we're not going to share that with you. But many of the districts they followed the law and they did share what they had. And, so many of these districts have programs to do residency checks on kids. So they'll show up at your house, they'll hire a private investigator, right? Some of the districts have internal staff who do this, right? So I talked to one district employee at a mid-sized district in California. She said, "You can't use my name." She's like, "Well, yeah, I go out and I'll investigate a homeless family, right? And I'll try to see, okay, where's their tent or where's their car parked, right? And the district's like, can we get this kid kicked out because the family's tent is in the wrong area?" The AP just did a great story about this woman in Atlanta who was evicted, and her kids were in this school. They were thriving in a school. She gets evicted. Her kids aren't kicked out immediately. There are some federal protections in place that they can't kick them out immediately, but that expires and then they're just SOL, right? The
Wow.
kids can't go, they can't go to the school that they were going to anymore. And then you've got, the districts don't like to talk about these things, right? Kelly's case kind of blew up and got a lot of attention. So the districts don't
Not
like
safe.
to call attention to these, contracts with private eyes and these home check policies. But the private eyes themselves, this is very profitable for them. So we have a video on our YouTube channel where we hired actors to say what some of these private eyes have said in public
Wow.
about their contracts with these districts. So one guy's like, well, we try to hire female
Right.
investigators because if you've got someone hanging outside a school with a camera, it raises a lot less eyebrows if it's a woman rather than a man, right? You got another investigator saying, well, sometimes the district tries to pull the wool over my eyes and they just tell me to check out, they're telling me to check out all the African American kids or all the Latino kids. And I gotta like say, no, I'm not doing that. Or they tell me, check out everybody, but leave the football players alone, right? And these people are saying this on the record, right? Because these folks are making money off this system. And so they don't have to do a lot of it. I think when they publicly prosecuted Kelly in Ohio, and this has happened a handful of times, there was a big uprising. And I think, it got a lot of attention. And so I think most of these districts have decided, okay, we're not going to prosecute people anymore. That hasn't happened in a bit, but
Okay.
they're going to still hire the investigators and they're still going to use the threat of prosecution to kick the kids out of school, right? So it's a system that's based on exclusion, and that's not how the public schools are supposed to operate. I think the
Yeah.
founders of the public school movement in this country, the common school movement, people like Horace Mann, I think they would be horrified to know how the system is operating in the 21st century, frankly, through much of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
They would not be pleased to see this is what's been going on because a lot of these schools are quasi-private schools for wealthy people operating on the public's dime.
It's really upsetting because I'm an educator.
Yeah.
I've worked in schools that were well to do, and I've actually worked in a lot of Title I schools.
Yeah.
And those Title I schools, at least in my experience, we would get a lot of programs and things thrown at us frequently. It's like, oh, we got funding for this, let's try this. But nothing was ever implemented fully, at least in my experience. And we had so many issues that we just didn't have enough resources and assistance to help our children with.
Yep.
So hearing these types of stories, it's so upsetting because I've seen, you know, the babies on the ground.
Sure.
That's what I think of is like the babies on the ground that are being affected by these policies, these old policies that were put in place. But I wanted to ask you, on paper, open enrollment sounds like a solution, but in practice, you show that the best schools almost never have open seats. So what's really going on and how can we fix that in your opinion?
Yeah. So one of the things that I found in my book is that open enrollment in California, right? There's this very nice sounding law from 1994, 1993, the open enrollment law. And it says specifically that, a child has a right to go to any school in the district, right? Regardless of where they live. The problem is there's an exception written into the law, which is they can't displace somebody who is zoned to go to that school. So, ironically, the only place in which attendance zones are written into California law is in the open enrollment law. And it sounds eminently reasonable. Hey, they just can't displace a kid, right?
Yeah.
But what happens in a place where, the school is 75% white and Asian and it's full because everybody's jammed into that attendance zone. So the school is full and you've got all of these working class folk who live just outside the boundaries within walking distance of the school in some cases. And they're told, no, you can't come. We are full with people who are zoned to go to this school. So the preference, the allowance for discrimination based on where you live is written into the open enrollment law. right? So that most open enrollment laws that I've seen have that exception, right, written in. Big problem. Now that said, open enrollment in general, good idea,
Yeah.
and it is going to allow for people to go to other schools that they aren't zoned to, as long as there's not these really coveted public schools. So it's not solving the most extreme version of the problem, but it is opening up other options, which I think is a good thing. So I don't want to come down too hard on open enrollment, but that is a problem. There's another loophole. So in Arizona, you spent time in Arizona. In
Mm.
Arizona, they have an open enrollment law that allows for a lot of cross district travel. So you can apply to a school that isn't your home district much more easily in Arizona than in most states, which is wonderful. But again, we have a loophole. The loophole is if your kid has an IEP, so that is if they've been designated as a kid with a disability, the open enrollment law in Arizona, and this is very similar in Wisconsin, they've written the law so that the district, the receiving district that gets the application, has the ability to say no if that kid has an IEP. And there's no requirement, oh, you have to do your own meeting, you have to you can basically just say, well, this kid has an IEP, they're a kid with a disability, our special ed program is at capacity, right? So that's a real concern. But they, what I really dislike about that law, and I know there are lots of special ed activists in Arizona trying to change this law. Hey, the district should have to, in Colorado, for example, they require the receiving district to do their own IEP to assess the student's needs and then to document, if they're saying you don't have space, you have to document why you don't have space, right? That is a much harder system to abuse than a system like Arizona, where they just, they get the application. Oh, the kid has an IEP. We want to keep our test scores high. Those special ed kids, they tend to bring down our scores. We've seen these moms in Arizona very angry, right? These were in Arizona. We have examples of moms who got their kids into the kids going to the school either because they live in the district or maybe they're using open enrollment within the district. The kid gets an IEP, and then they come back and say, oh, we don't have capacity for this kid next year. So they're kicking a kid out of a school, right?
Wow.
That they're already in and that they're already thriving at it. They're already receiving services at, because they're saying, oh, because we have this loophole. So anyway, I think you have to be very careful. And I think we have to be very careful when we write these laws. People who work in public schools are people just like the rest of us, right? You give them certain incentives. Lots of people in public schools are going to do the right thing no matter what. They're going to do it quietly. You're never going to know. They're going to do it. They're going to do the right thing with no incentive whatsoever, even if it makes their job harder. But there are some people who work in the public schools who are going to respond to those incentives. And unless you put in place protections for families, some of these folks are going to make decisions that are discriminatory, right? And you see that, we saw it during the redlining era. We saw it there are lots of examples, right? You give people incentives. Some people will find a way to use those incentives to do unethical things. And so I think we just need to have oversight systems, right? We should be publishing way more data. Like, we should require schools, every public school, you have to accept every application that comes in, right? And if you're going to deny that person enrollment, that kid enrollment, you should have to send them official letter saying what is the reasoning, and then you should have to publish that data. Now, that doesn't open up the schools. They could still say, well, this kid lives outside our attendance zone, so we don't have to accept them. But if we had that data, then we'd be able to see, oh, there's all these families that want to go to this school who live outside the zone. I think there would be much more public outrage. But right now, all of that takes place, it's completely on the down low, and the schools try to hide what's going on because they don't want people to know that they're turning away kids who live half a mile away, right? That's not what a school wants. They want to be able to turn that kid away, but they don't want anyone to know that they're turning the kid away and why they're turning the kid away.
Yeah. It's again like with the quiet war thing. It's like I think when it comes to communities, like when these things are happening, it's like individual families. And I think these conversations are so important because we don't know that we're having the same problem that our neighbor is having or
Yeah.
same problem that somebody is having across the nation. When I was working in Nevada as an educator and the issues that I saw, I just felt like, oh, this is just a small community problem of like my school not doing enough, at least all my
Yep.
opinions and stuff. But as I started to do this work and having these conversations, it really starts to open your eyes to what's happening across the nation. And thank you for writing this book because for myself, I was like, oh, this is why my parents did what they did. And they weren't the only parents that did this.
Well, that's right. Like, how many other kids were lying about their addresses to get into that Culver City school,
Yeah.
right?
I,
I
I,
mean, you don't know.
I don't
It's
know.
impossible to know because everybody's being hush hush about it.
Because we have to, because we're doing what's in the best interest of our children because nobody else is going to do it. So
Yeah.
thank you
Yep.
for highlighting these stories. So I want to end with this. In your opinion, what conversation should we be having in education right now that we're
Uh, well, I think this is one of the big ones, right? One of the big ones. I think there are other big ones, right? The science of reading. That
Mhm.
whole conversation is a great conversation, and I so much admire Emily Hanford for uncovering that story of how the science curricula in our or I'm sorry the reading curricula in our across the public schools was kind of subject to this groupthink, right? And so really the quality of reading instruction has been well short of what we know works, right, for decades and decades. So great work being done there. We're trying to add to that this aspect of, are the public schools open to all, right? Are they really open to all kids? And I don't think they are. And I think parents just need to understand, like, in some ways, changing these laws is going to be very hard,
Yeah.
but what can't go on forever won't go on forever. And I think more and more parents are waking up to this reality, right? That there are often high performing public schools in your community, but there are policies in place that prevent your kids from getting a fair shot to go to those schools. And so we just try to at the very least, I mean, we're hoping that more and more districts will choose to do what like New Orleans has done, which is get rid of attendance zones, right? Or at least let's have open enrollment. Let's try some things. I love this idea of just let's reserve 15% of the seats for kids who live outside the zone. So the zone's still there. It still, allows for the creation of a neighborhood school, but we're not making these arbitrary lines so important. The other way you could do it is you could just say, hey, like if you live within 3 miles of a school or 5 miles of a school, then you should be guaranteed a fair shot at going to that school. So we can't have these just arbitrary lines. We try to propose common sense solutions that wouldn't like disrupt the whole system, but that would decrease the importance of these lines, these arbitrary lines over time. So we get less distortions in the real estate market. We get less of these really huge injustices of kids, being excluded from schools that are nearby to them. So we're trying to add to that. But I do think, we're in an interesting time where the pandemic, I think, opened up a lot of people's eyes about some negative things going on in the public schools. And I think we are at a time when parents are kind of opening their eyes and starting to say, okay, I need to pay attention to this. I need to go visit different schools. I can't just move to a neighborhood and just assume, I'm going to move to this neighborhood with a bunch of people like me. Wherever they're sending their kids to school is going to be fine. I'm just going to, use the local public school. I mean, I think people of all incomes do that and have been doing that for decades in this country. It's kind of a form of complacency, I think. And I think parents are starting to realize, no, I need to understand what's going on in my child's school. I need to understand, the performance of the kids. How are they doing? Are they coming out reading at grade level? Are they coming out being able to do math at the level they should? But I need to understand other things. I need to understand, what is the culture of the school, right? Uh, Go ahead.
It's so important, the culture of a school.
It is. It is. And it sounds like you found a school that you love for your kids. What do
Mhm.
you love about that school? Like what's special about it?
So my son's school, he goes to a Montessori school, and
Yeah.
it's on I think it's, like, on an acre, and they have a lot
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah.
and I'm actually helping them write a grant to create this pavilion for an outdoor space
Yeah.
to increase, like, their work outside, but the teachers are friendly. The founders, they started this 30 years ago.
Oh, wow.
They started in a church and they're super passionate about educating kids and it feels
Yep.
like one giant family. So I love that for him. My
Yep.
older two, they have so much at their disposal. So part of where they go, they do Florida virtual as well as in person, and
Okay.
have I really like the extracurricular activities that are offered there, and they
Yep.
really enjoy it. So I'm
Yep.
thankful that we found it, and it's been great.
Yeah, I just love to hear that. I think what you said about your son's school is just the element of family, right? Does certain
Mhm.
schools have vibes. I mean, we've all worked in workplaces where the culture was so much fun, right? And you
Yeah.
just feel like you're going to work with a mission every day. And then we've also worked in places where you didn't have that, right? And there was like, everybody's complaining about being there. And anyway, you just want your kid to be in addition to being someplace where they're going to get educated, you want your kid to be in a healthy environment so they get used to being treated well, where they're going to, when the teachers are going to have a big smile for them when they see them first thing in the morning. And that kind of intangible stuff is really, really important in addition to like the scores. And I do think the scores are important, right? Like,
Yeah.
you want your kid to be going to a school where most of the kids can read, right? Because they're not just learning from the teacher, they're learning from the other kids. So even if the instruction's great, if most of those kids are lower level, right? It's perfectly reasonable for parents to want to seek out a school where the kids are performing well, because your kid's going to be picking stuff up from the other kids, not just from the
So
teacher.
true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for being on the podcast. I'm sure there's a ton of things I didn't ask you that other people are like, "Why didn't you ask that?" So,
Well,
yeah,
we could talk forever, I think, Felicia, but yeah.
so I think so. So how can people reach you if they have a question or wanna get involved with the work?
Yeah, my email is tim@available-to-all.org. Our website is available-to-all.org. If you have any evidence of shenanigans going on at a school district, we have a button on our website where you can press to report abuse. You can do that anonymously. If there's some school, like a school that's doing operating a really exclusive attendance zone, or if there's a magnet, sometimes some of these magnet schools give advantages to kids who are wealthier or who are white or Asian because they're trying to get their mix right,
Mm,
or residency checks. We love to expose unethical or even illegal things that school districts are doing. And so, if any of your listeners have any information about that stuff, we're always looking for those stories because it helps us kind of tell the story about that secret war that you're talking about
yeah.
of parents versus these school districts. So, yeah, and I always love to hear from parents. So, feel free to email me directly as well. Tim@available-to-all.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast and sharing your story. And if anybody has any questions, please email Tim. And then I'll also put links to all the things that he's done, as well as a fine line so you can purchase that as well. So, with that, I hope you enjoyed this talk and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you, Felicia.
You're welcome.